Welcome to Education Connect by Knovva, the podcast that explores innovative teaching methods and success stories, newsworthy updates in education, and current trends in the classroom. Whether you're a veteran educator, an industry thought leader, or a parent navigating the academic landscape for your child, we've got you covered. And hey, we know all about the hectic schedules in academics, so we're all about delivering content that's relevant, concise, and actionable. So hit that subscribe button and let's learn better together. Hi everyone, and welcome to Education Connect by Knovva, the podcast where we learn from experts, innovators, and leaders in the world of education. This episode is all about navigating the changing admissions landscape for private schools. Significant changes have taken place over the last 3 years, and in order to be successful, you have to stay ahead of the curve. So stay tuned until the end, where we'll tell you more of our best practices for applying to private school in the following years to come. Today, I'm here with Diane Barnett. You might remember Diane from our first episode. She's an education consultant with nearly 30 years of experience. Since her start, she's been a mentor to over 400 students, 96% of whom were accepted into their top choice schools. Hi, Diane.
Hi, Erin. Thanks for having me back.
Of course. Thank you for coming on to the show.
You are most welcome.
So it's been a wild 3 years in academics. The pandemic certainly shifted things, especially in terms of student life. One example that comes to mind is how schools handled remote learning. So while many public schools either shut down completely or weren't prepared for remote learning, some private schools continued as normal. Why do you think this was?
Well, especially for boarding schools, what they had the opportunity to do that no other schools could do is really they created a bubble. Just like some families joined with one other family, right? And the 5 of them or the 7 of them could speak with each other and be together because they agreed that that would just be their bubble and they wouldn't bring other people in or they wouldn't go outside of it. Boarding school is a bubble in and of itself, right? So many schools stopped the day students from coming at first, but so many of the staff, faculty, administration live on those campuses. So they really were able to create safely a space where they could continue educating students and not risk, people bringing COVID was the germ, but bringing things in or people carrying it out. So that was the first level that was affected the least, the boarders who got to stay on their campuses. Now, most schools had to move out in March, right when the quarantine started. But they were the first schools to be able to resume, to bring kids back on campus, to do that 2-week quarantine, to have negative COVID tests. And then they kept their kids there for the duration. Most schools canceled spring break. Once the students got there, they couldn't leave, but they were able to continue education as normal, as much as you can in the world that was no longer normal. Stepping down from that, general private schools, not boarding, are still a much smaller in general class size. We have public schools and public high schools, especially in the United States, that have 6, 7, 8,000 students. Logistically, that's just impossible to control the comings and the goings and the exposure rates. But when your school has 140 kids, that's a lot more manageable. So the teachers had smaller classroom size. In general, the teachers had a little bit more flexibility. They don't go by the same state guidelines for curriculum. So there was flexibility in what they could teach, what they could skip, what they could, stress. So it just gave the private schools an edge with contained campuses, smaller class size, and the flexibility of curriculum.
As a result, I think a lot of parents saw how valuable private education was or could potentially be, especially when it comes to a major disruptor like that, seeing students, kind of have to turn their lives upside down versus someone who really gets to experience normal academic life. In a recent survey by the Cato Institute, 68 private schools reported an increase of over 52% in student enrollment. And this also included private pre-kindergarten schools. What are your thoughts on this increase of applicants in the last couple of years?
Well, the first thing I think parents, mothers, fathers, guardians saw firsthand how difficult it is to be a teacher. We were all kind of thrust into roles unprepared to be the teacher, the tutor, the curriculum director for our family. But when the kids came home, little kids, medium kids, big kids, it became much more of an onus on parents. High schoolers and middle schoolers could go to their rooms on their laptops and kind of handle that situation themselves for the most part. But the little guys, you can't put a first grader in front of a computer for 6 hours and tell them to pay attention, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I think families really began to reassess the priorities for their family. Maybe private schools seemed like a luxury that they really couldn't afford. And all of a sudden, the value of what a teacher provides to a student, what a classroom provides to a student became much more apparent for these families. So, finances were reassessed. And I think a lot of people are choosing, if at all possible, to at least explore private schools, especially in the younger grades. It's hard to teach first grade, second grade, third grade, preschool.
Absolutely.
Those are hard things. And so much of that time, that bandwidth that mothers and fathers, guardians, they didn't have extra to give. They were adjusting to remote working. They were adjusting to a 40-hour plus extended workday. And I think a lot of us reassessed priorities. I think it's important in this conversation to remember that still the amount of children that go to private school in this country is relatively minuscule compared to those who go to public school. So the National Center for Education Statistics that keeps track of all of those things said that 9% of US kids go to private school in any regard, whether that's a preschool program or through 12th grade. So parents who pay for their child to go to school. So that 9% translates to about 4.7 million kids. Still a lot of kids, but we have 53.9 million kids who go to public school. So it's still, and that number becomes really important when we get into later in this discussion talking about admissions, because you are competing with the educational elite by the time you get into competing for some of these elite private school spots. It's the best of the best, the kids that have the families who have prioritized education, the kids who have a passion for something. So although a lot of families are exploring it and trying it, it still is a competitive game out there, definitely competitive.
That's you bring up a really interesting point, because even though the numbers or the figures compared to each other between private and public school admitted students, the numbers are quite low when you say them compared side by side. But when we see schools handling kind of an influx of new applicants, and particularly with some states now offering universal private school options, making private school a little bit more accessible for some families, I'm curious to see if admissions are going to increase or have already started increasing for some schools. Maybe not all, but perhaps some of them are seeing higher volumes of applicants.
They are almost across the board seeing a higher number of applicants.
Okay.
Seeing a higher number of applicants does not, though, translate into higher enrollment. Most of the schools, now we're not talking about your local parochial school down the street, right? We're talking about some of the elite private schools, the top 20 or top 50 private high schools in the country that if we said the names, everybody would recognize them. They don't have any more dorms. They don't have any more beds. So the number of kids, and one of their selling points is always been small class size, an intimate setting. They don't want or need to grow exponentially. So they could admit more day students. There's ways to get around a little bit of that increased enrollment based upon increased demand. But those schools really are not changing their infrastructure. They're not rushing to build new dorms. They're not adding faculty. They want to keep the size it is because that's purposeful. They want that faculty to teacher ratio to be 7-to-1 or 8-to-1. That's one of their selling points. So yes, there are definitely more kids applying, but there are not necessarily more spots.
So that might then translate to an increase in competition. So
absolutely.
How do you think let's say, private schools admissions on a general basis are handling an influx of new applicants since the acceptance rates aren't rising along with them?
Right. Right. And in fact, the acceptance rates are falling as a result of the sheer numbers of applicants versus spots. That those numbers are a little bit, we're seeing the same thing in college admissions that have gone test optional. Some of these top boarding schools, there are several exams that have been historically used, the SSAT, the ISEE, some schools have their own entrance replacement exams. And what happens with those is it becomes an accessibility issue, especially in the times of a global pandemic. So a lot of schools, just like colleges made SAT and ACT optional, a lot of schools have made the high school entrance exams optional. So what that does is you no longer have to be testing at the 90th or 94th percentile to be competitive. Not all kids are great test takers. That doesn't mean they're not great students. So that opens the doors to a lot of kids to apply that maybe wouldn't have because they thought they didn't have a chance before. Mm-hmm. So it changes the competition pool a little bit. Schools also, whether we like these standardized tests or not, and everyone has strong feelings about them, it is the one gauge that is the same for everyone. There's grade inflation at schools. There's GPAs are all on different scales. So the one metric that is consistent across the board is these entrance exams. So when we do away with those, we eliminate the one metric that is quote unquote fair for all kids. Now, it's not fair for all kids, but it's the same, at least for all kids. So increasing the numbers without increasing the staff. Remember, most of these places, most of these schools have 4, maybe 5 admission workers. So when they're getting applications by the hundreds or thousands, what that does is where they used to look at it for 12 minutes, they're now looking at each application for under 6 minutes. You do not have a lot of time to make an impact. So the interview becomes exceptionally important for these private schools. Colleges have gotten away from interviewing for the most part, but most all of the private high schools that I know about in all parts of the country require an interview. Most of them require a parent interview as well.
Let's talk about that interview a little bit more in that case. So given that's maybe the best way to stand out, and of course, the really only way to put a face to your application in terms of getting into that private school, how do you suggest that the student or the parent or both prepare or plan ahead for these interviews?
So it's really difficult. Let's not forget, when we are talking about private school admissions, you were doing that in the fall of your 8th grade year. So you are 12, 13, maybe 14 years old.
Yeah.
That is a lot of, you haven't had a job interview yet. You haven't had a lot of interactions where adults are bombarding you with questions. It's a big process. So the best way to get ready for it, for parents who think this will be the trajectory for their kids starting in 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, expose them to adults, take them to your work, let them have conversations with other grownups who are not your family, not grandma and grandpa. That's lovely, but have them get more comfortable speaking to adults. Talk about eye contact. Teach your kids what a handshake is, a strong handshake, and how that represents you. Teach them confidence in their posture. All these things are not a one-time conversation the night before you're going into Groton or whatever for an interview, right? These are conversations and these are practices that need to happen for months, if not years, before the process. If you really want to show who you are, the first thing that you have to overcome are those nerves. You have to be able to exhale and, be comfortable enough in the situation that you can have a dialogue with the interviewer. That's really what they're looking for. These places they're educators. They're pro kids. They are not there to trip you up and make you feel uncomfortable. They want a dialogue, But the best dialogues happen when both parties are comfortable in the situation. And that's a hard thing for a 12 or 13-year-old to get comfortable with.
Hmm. I mean, that must be, at least looking back to when I was 13, I don't remember ever interviewing at that age for anything. So, so this could certainly
I
be.
remember even babysitting, and somebody would say, well, how much do you get per hour? And I'm just like, oh, I don't know. I don't think I'm supposed to say that. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't, whatever you want to pay me, like it's
Yeah.
really nerve wracking. Most kids haven't had those kind of experiences. So just giving them exposure to more adults and talking about, how you would handle that. What do you think of X, Y, or Z, and why?
Mm.
We need to teach kids that the purpose of the interview is to show who you are. So there has to be a why behind every answer. You can't just say, I like this. I like your school because it's ranked number 2 in the country. They know that. Why
Mm.
do you like this school? What about it matches your personality and your life, your goals for your education? Be specific, learn about the school before you go in. And just because it's number 2 in the country or number 2 in your state doesn't mean that's the best fit for you. Find out if it is before you go in the doors.
Mm. Great advice. So, just to recap, a really good start would be to expose students early on to adult conversations or interactions with adults that might not necessarily be familiar or super comfortable with, where they can kind of get on their toes a little bit and think critically about the conversation. They might also practice some questions ahead of time, explain the why, and get specific about the reason why they're interested in a school beyond just it's the top school or the top 5, whatever, and why it makes sense for that student to get in.
What admissions officers are looking for in the interview is these schools have amazing opportunities, almost limitless opportunities for students that go there. They bring in speakers, world-class speakers. They bring in orchestras and ballet companies, just everything, sports teams. It's just amazing.
Mm.
And they want students that will drink that up, take advantage of all those opportunities, and then internalize all those experiences and become contributing, thoughtful, critically thinking adults who, on the way to college, go to great colleges and then represent these schools proudly in years to come, right? They're thinking down the road they want a strong alumni pool. So they want kids who will take advantage of all these opportunities. Show them that you're that kid.
And we can get into a little bit more about the questions and things that they might expect to hear during an interview. But for a student who's trying to do some research before an interview, what are some helpful places that they could look to find these specific details about a school?
I say the same thing for college. The schools are telling you who they want and what they want in 2 places: their mission statement that you will find on every school website and their core values. Sometimes those things are merged together and sometimes they're delineated separately. But every school, you will find their mission statement and their core values. They are telling you what is important to them. Is service their focus? Is diversity their focus? Is intellectual curiosity their focus? And all those things will probably be mentioned. But if you go through that and really say, oh, I disagree with one of those things, okay, that might not be your school, and that's okay. Or, oh my gosh, they just put into words exactly what I feel about X issue, then that might be your place. So look for things that resonate with you. But the best place to start are the school websites. Do the virtual tours, even if you're far away. Strongly suggest doing a real campus tour if you can. Most of them do a tour combined with the interview, so it's a part of that same day. If this is easier to find on college campuses, but a lot of the boarding school campuses and private schools I've been on last year have access, whether it's in the main building or in the student cafeteria. Pick up a student-run newspaper. See what the kids on that campus are saying about that school. That's unfiltered for the most part. They have freedom to write whatever they want. That's a great indicator of what the kids on that who live there are feeling and thinking and experiencing as part of the campus. That's a great place to start also.
Awesome examples. Really good. Yeah, I'm definitely thinking that one of the great ways to get to know a campus, just, in a well-rounded way, is to also ask students. And so this is an awesome suggestion to go right into student literature and see what, what's being published on the campus. So awesome.
And they
Now,
train their student tour guides very well. Colleges do too. They those students are trained really well. So if you really want some deeper questions, talk to a student who's not the tour guide. Because
very
they're
true.
told well to put the best picture of their university or their college or their boarding school on display. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just know that that's happening.
Mhm.
It's a sales pitch.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really good advice. Awesome. So now you also mentioned earlier that there is almost certainly a student interview and potentially also a parent interview. Now, in some formats, the parent and the student might interview together, and sometimes they might interview separately. So
Yeah, it's almost always separate.
almost always separate. Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that. So in that case, then the questions that they'll ask both, I assume, are going to be quite different from each other. So how could parents and students prepare for questions, and maybe what are some typical questions that they could expect?
For students, I always tell them the first thing that everyone is going to ask you, regardless of where you're applying, is either introduce yourself or tell me about yourself. They truly want to know what makes you tick, who are you? And conversely, what they're going to ask the parents is, tell me about your son, daughter, child, right? This is the time to brag, tell them how amazing you think they are, give them some evidence to support how amazing you believe them to be. And that's always going to be one question. The parents get a lot of questions about how do you see your family contributing to our school or being a part of our school? Schools want family involvement, definitely. And for students, I always talk about it. If you think about who you in the course of your day, who do you remember at the end of a week? When you've met professionals, you've been at a networking event, you've met your boyfriend's parents, whatever. It's the people you've made a connection with. So the interviews that are happening in person, you walk into an office. Okay, look around. Do they have a picture of their golden retriever? They love dogs. Does their son have a lacrosse uniform on? Talk to them about, do you love lacrosse too? Or they have a pennant from Ohio State. Oh, they're probably a football fan. Make a connection, genuine. Don't make it up. But if you like dogs too, talk about that golden retriever. If you love college football or the Big Ten, talk about that Ohio State pennant. Make a connection. That is who people will remember. And your job in the interview is to be memorable.
That's fantastic. Those are words to live by. Once again, I feel like every single time we have this interview, you say like a key statement, and I think that's really a good one that we need to highlight. So your job in the interview is to be memorable, for sure.
And genuine. Don't make it up. If you're allergic or afraid of dogs, don't try to go on a 5-minute segue about the golden retriever, because it will fail. It won't come across as disingenuous. So be memorable, but be yourself. And these interviews definitely favor extroverted students. It is easier for extroverts to make those cocktail party conversations, right? But don't be too discouraged if you're an introvert, because introverts can also make deeper connections. So it's okay if you don't have 100 things to talk about. Talk about the 3 things you believe in and talk about them with passion. It's okay if you're not all over the place. It's okay if you don't know everything about Big Ten football. You don't have to. Do you know everything there is to know about rowing or the state of the water in the Charles River or whatever your thing is? There's no better things to love than less. What is important is the passion and that you really feel strongly about something.
Perfect. So we're focusing a bit on the face-to-face interview, and by this point, we could assume that most interviews will be exactly that. But what about if a student has a digital interview? Are there any suggestions you might have for them preparing for something over Zoom or FaceTime? I'm not really sure which one would be
Yeah,
applicable, but
I think most
Google
schools
Meet.
do use Zoom. There's still a ton of international applicants and schools understand that not everyone can or would jump on a plane to come to the United States. A lot of schools travel overseas, and so they can still do those interviews face to face in not the school setting, so you wouldn't get the tour. But Zoom, I think kids have gotten a little bit. All of us have gotten a little bit complacent. You know, in 2020, we were still wearing all really nice clothes, and now we're lucky if we have a shirt that's presentable, right?
Absolutely.
So I tell my kids, make sure they can see your whole face, your mouth, your head. Make sure you're well lit. Make sure you do have on a nice shirt. Match the dress code of the school. If the school is a place, and this is true for in person as well, if the school has a uniform and boys are in suit and tie, and girls are in skirts, jumpers, whatever, match that. Wear that. So just because you're online, don't think you should dress down. You can wear your pajama bottoms if you want, but from what can be seen, match the dress code of the school. You need to keep your face centered. You need to speak clearly and still try to engage on a personal level. But, you know, having the lights on, keeping your face centered and dressing professionally for what the school requires of you are still really important.
So we just talked about competition being kind of one of the major pivot changes in the last few years when it comes to private and college, actually, private school and college admissions. Are there any other maybe adjustments or changes in the admissions process or kind of trends that you are seeing at this point in time?
You know, I think with more applicants for the same number of spots, the percentages of admissions are going down. It's getting harder and harder. Those are schools that used to accept, 15 to 20% are now in single digits, 9, 8, 7% acceptance rates. That feels really discouraging, and it's really difficult out there. I think the same thing holds true when the acceptance rate was 15% or if it's 5%. Show the school why that school and you are a match. What about their offerings speaks to you? Have you already finished pre-calculus in 8th grade, so you need 4 years of higher math? Make sure they offer that. If the highest math class they have is Calc AP, AP Calc AB, well, you're going to age out of math at that school in 9th grade. That's not a fit for you. Okay, so tell them, show them you've done your research, tell them why their school specifically is a match for you specifically. The thing that you don't have the opportunity to do for the most part in college is have that one-on-one FaceTime with an interviewer. And that no matter what the acceptance rates are, that time where you can express yourself and show them what an asset you would be to their program and how you would take advantage of all the opportunities that their school offers to you. That's your key. That's how you set yourself apart. And it has to be genuine. It has to be real. And I chose this school because it's ranked number X is never the answer. It can be why you started your journey, why you started looking into that school. And that's fine. Everyone has to start somewhere, but that's not your final why. So search for that.
So the why and really the specifics behind it and your application. That's wonderful. Are there any other suggestions just to finish up here? Are there any other maybe thoughts or kind of takeaways for students who are planning to navigate or are currently navigating the private school admissions for this year or maybe in the next year to come?
If you're still on your applications this year, get them in. You don't have much time, less than a month.
That's true. Yeah.
It's okay. You have a little bit of time. Just keep working. There are so many essays. And I know kids get fatigued with the process, But the final essay that you submit needs to be as strong, as thought out, as grammatically correct and structured, as well as the first one that you submitted. So give yourself the time. It's okay to ask a proofreader. It's okay to get suggestions from others, but know that writing is super personal, and it should be. These are your stories. No one knows your stories as well as you do. So take advice with a grain of salt. If you don't want to change the wording of something, don't change it. Now, if your English teacher tells you need 3 more commas, I suggest you take that advice. but the meat of your story should be yours. And it's important that when you go in for your interview, the writing level, the communication level that is exhibited in those essays are what you are able to exhibit in real life. There are people who every year, for whatever reason, try to cheat or backdoor or have somebody write their essays or have somebody do this or that. If someone else writes your essays, that person isn't going to go in for the interview. And those levels of dialogue and communication and your speech pattern are not going to match. Admission officers are not stupid. Most of them have been doing it for a long time. They're pretty savvy at the process. So be authentic in your interview, but be authentic in your essay. Let your voice come through.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We are just out of time, but this is a great wrap up. Thank you again, Diane. You have some awesome suggestions, and I'm sure that any student or parent listening to this podcast is going to have a lot of great takeaways for their next application that they send in. So thank you again.
Thanks, Erin.
All right. Take care.
Bye.